This is what's generally known as a back bleed. The Clark's brake is specifically designed to be back bled, and this is the easy way to do it. First thing that you need to do is secure the bars to the bike so that they can't turn. So the first thing that we do is loosen the lever clamp on the bar so that we can easily and cleanly turn the lever without any danger of scoring the surface of the handlebar. So having turned the lever around the bar, we then just lightly tighten the two bolts which retain it in place, because what we don't want is the lever moving about whilst we're working. The next part of the operation is to remove the cover over the reservoir on the lever, which is done by removing the two screws which retain it in place. You'll notice that I'm wearing hand protection. With hydraulic fluid, that's always a good idea because it is quite caustic material. Take the top off the reservoir and you'll notice that underneath there is a rubber gasket. This gasket is compressible. This compressibility is essential to the functioning of this type of hydraulic brake. The next step is to level the bike in the work stand, because that will allow you to put the maximum amount of fluid into the reservoir. In order to do that, you can use the fluid inside the reservoir to tell you when the bike is level. Once you've got the bike level, you're ready to start the next step. The next step of the process is to use a large syringe, normally between about 30 and 60 ml capacity, which you'll need to partially fill with DOT fluid, ideally from a fresh bottle. The reason we use a fresh bottle is because DOT absorbs water, and if there's water in the fluid, it impairs its function and can cause some corrosion inside the system. You need to ensure that once you have the fluid in the syringe, like this, there are no air bubbles adhering to the side of the syringe itself. You will inevitably have some air bubbles inside the hose. However, the bleed process will eliminate those air bubbles, as you'll see later. Once we've got to this position, the next thing that we need to do is to attach the end of the hose here to the bleed nipple on the brake, which is here. On the front brake, the bleed nipple is always at the highest point of the brake. On the rear brake, it's sometimes necessary to detach it from the frame and to ensure that the bleed nipple is at the highest point on the caliper. The bleed pipe, as it's known, presses straight onto the nipple. When you're using a new hose, this is sometimes a little bit more difficult than when you're using one that's been used before. Once you have the pipe firmly attached to the bleed nipple, we loosen the bleed nipple, normally about a 1/2 to 3/4 of a turn. It turns anti-clockwise. Ensuring that the pipe is held firmly onto the nipple, we then push fluid from the syringe through the tube and into the braking system. Inevitably, some air will also go into the system, but the bleed process will eventually eliminate that. As you push fluid into the system, you need to watch the lever and you need to watch the level of fluid in the reservoir. What you want to avoid, obviously, is the fluid that you force in at the bottom overflowing at the top of the system. Once the fluid level has come up level with the top of the reservoir on the lever, close the bleed nipple by turning it clockwise with the spanner. Once you've found that the reservoir is filled to capacity, you can draw the excess fluid off with a second syringe. You should leave a very small amount of fluid in the bottom of the reservoir, like this. The rest of the bleed operation is a simple repeat of the process that you've already followed. Releasing the bleed nipple, forcing fluid into the system, watching it emerge at the reservoir. We keep doing this and draining the excess fluid off the reservoir until we get to a point where the fluid that appears in the reservoir has no air bubbles in it, as we have in this instance. Once you have that, you have a fully bled system, which is fluid from top to bottom with no air inclusions at all. Once you have clear fluid in the top reservoir, you can simply close off the bleed nipple by turning it 3/4 of a turn clockwise, as you have at the end of every other injection sequence. Remove the spanner, draw any fluid which is in the pipe back into the syringe and remove the pipe itself. You do this to avoid any fluid flowing out of the pipe and onto any parts of the caliper assembly, the pads or the rotor, which are two areas where you definitely don't want fluid. The final part of the operation is to refit the reservoir cap, which only fits one way, by dropping it on, inserting the screws, and gently and evenly tightening the two screws into place with a Phillips screwdriver. Don't tighten one screw all the way up and then tighten the other. Do it progressively on each screw until you have even tightness on both. This will ensure that the gasket underneath makes a good seal with the reservoir. There will be some small amount of spillage from around the top of the reservoir, which should be wiped up. Normally with DOT fluid, the best thing to clean up with is a piece of paper waste like this, and if there's a large amount of spillage, some clean water. The last part of the operation is to simply release these two screws once more, which clamp the bar and lever together. Turn the lever until its angle matches the angle of the lever on the other side, and retighten two clamp bolts to hold the lever firmly on the handlebar. We release the bars from the frame. We pull the lever to ensure that the lever stops with a nice firm action. This is the brake fully bled.